So leveraging our strengths and focusing on areas of alignment, Canada and China can create greater stability, security, and prosperity for both our nations. And to that end, President Xi and I are announcing that Canada and China are forging a new strategic partnership. It will focus on 5 key areas where both our nations stand to make substantial and sustained gains.
Canada just delivered a shockwave across North America. Prime Minister Mark Carney returned from Beijing with a grand strategic deal worth up to $1 trillion in trade and investment potential. And whether Washington wants to admit it or not, this moment teaches Donald Trump a lesson he has avoided for years. Canada is no longer willing to sit in America's shadow. This agreement isn't symbolic. It's a structural shift that rewrites how Canada positions itself in a world dominated by US-China rivalry. For the first time in 8 years, a Canadian Prime Minister landed in Beijing with a mandate to reset relations after nearly a decade of political tension, diplomatic retaliation, and hardening trade barriers. Over 2 days of negotiations, Carney met President Xi Jinping, Premier Li, and senior Chinese economic leaders. The outcome was a comprehensive strategic partnership covering clean energy, trade, food security, global governance, public safety, and cultural ties. A few decisions stood out immediately. Carney restored most favored nation tariff treatment to Chinese electric vehicles, allowing up to 49,000 units into the Canadian market each year under the standard 6.1% rate. At the same time, China agreed to slash tariffs on Canadian canola from 84% down to roughly 15%, while lifting barriers on canola meal, seafood, peas, and several processed goods. The two sides agreed to intensify cooperation on fentanyl precursors, cybercrime, and financial crime. And in a symbolic diplomatic gesture, China announced visa-free travel for Canadians. Carney framed the entire package as designing new tracks, not returning to old habits. The message was clear: Canada intends to diversify at speed and scale after years of turbulence with both China and the United States.
Let's be honest, Trump's second-term trade strategy is built on the assumption that Canada lacks alternatives. His escalating tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos, combined with threats to rewrite USMCA in 2026, were designed to force Ottawa back into line. But Carney has just dismantled that leverage. By opening new channels with China, he's signaling that Canada will no longer allow its economic destiny to be dictated by Washington's political cycles. He is using China not as a pivot away from the United States entirely, but as a counterweight powerful enough to restore balance. In practical terms, this means Trump cannot assume automatic compliance from Canada when negotiating the next phase of North American trade.
China gains access to a G7 partner willing to engage constructively in clean tech cooperation at a time when US-China relations remain deeply strained. Yet Canada gains something far more tangible: the reopening of its single most important agricultural market, new opportunities for its energy sector, and access to advanced EV supply chains. Carney is not embracing China out of dependence. He is using the partnership to solve real, immediate Canadian problems, from prairie farm incomes to the stagnation of Canada's EV market, while positioning the country as a stable, predictable economic environment that global investors can rely on. Publicly, Trump downplayed the impact of Canada's deal, saying Ottawa should pursue any agreement that benefits its economy. But underneath the surface, this is clearly a point of irritation. The United States is attempting to purge Chinese electric vehicles from the continent entirely. Trump relies on the argument that Chinese EVs are a national security threat, and that North America must build its own supply chains without Beijing. Carney just undercut that narrative by welcoming Chinese EVs and positioning them as a lever to develop Canada's own automotive sector. The contrast could not be sharper. While Trump is using tariffs to fence China out, Carney is using China's industrial strength to accelerate Canada's clean energy transition.
EV affordability remains the Achilles heel of both the American and Canadian energy transition. U.S. automakers cannot produce a low-cost EV at scale, and the industry is slowing under Trump's rollback of environmental incentives. Canada, however, is choosing a different path. By opening its market to Chinese EVs, Carney is resetting price expectations for consumers and creating competitive pressure on domestic and U.S. automakers. That pressure may force a long-overdue modernization of North America's EV ecosystem, but it also means Trump loses the ability to dictate the pace of electrification across the continent.
The impact on Canadian farmers is immediate. For years, canola producers have faced volatile export markets, unpredictable Chinese restrictions, and little support from Washington when disputes arose. Slashing tariffs to around 15% restores access to a market of 1.4 billion consumers and unlocks billions in annual exports. Politically, this strengthens Carney's standing in the prairies, proving that his diversification strategy can deliver concrete benefits that U.S. policy alone cannot provide. One of the most significant moves in Carney's Beijing visit didn't get the headlines it deserved. Canada reaffirmed its ambition to export 50 million tons of LNG annually to Asian markets by 2030. That places Canada in direct competition with the United States, which has long assumed that Asia would be a natural buyer of American LNG. Carney's pitch that Canadian LNG is lower risk, lower carbon, and lower cost challenges one of the pillars of Trump's America First energy agenda. It also deepens Canada's economic anchor in the Indo-Pacific region, giving Ottawa leverage that extends beyond simple trade balances. Taken together, these decisions reveal a Canada that no longer behaves like a passive middle power. Carney is positioning the country to shape outcomes rather than simply respond to American or Chinese moves. The visa-free travel announcement, support for Canada's APEC 2029 bid, and expanded cultural exchanges are all elements of a broader diplomatic strategy. They portray Canada as a stable, open, and forward-looking partner at a moment when global governance structures are under severe strain. And they send a quiet but unmistakable message back to Washington. Canada will cooperate, but it will not be cornered. Carney's Beijing breakthrough marks the beginning of a more assertive Canadian foreign policy. The United States expected loyalty through pressure. Carney responded with diversification through strength. As Washington prepares for a contentious USMCA review in 2026, Canada enters the conversation with more options, more leverage, and more confidence than at any point in the past decade. The real question now is how Trump will adapt. Will the United States accept a more independent Canada, or will it escalate the pressure? And if U.S.-China tensions flare again, as they almost certainly will Carney's new strategic framework protect Canada from the shockwaves, or place Ottawa right at the center of the storm? Either way, this moment marks a profound shift. Canada has stepped out of America's shadow, and the world is watching what happens next.
We need it for national security. We have to have it.
The U.S. president recently appointed an envoy to the territory. Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry originally said he aims to, quote, make Greenland a part of the U.S. Anand says she plans to visit the Greenland community of Nuuk early in the new year to open a consulate. She says Denmark is a major partner of Canada, and she's urging NATO to focus more on threats in the north.
Canada has just stepped into the Arctic debate with a clarity and conviction that caught Washington off guard. At the very moment a Trump-aligned U.S. official tried to revive the notion of absorbing Greenland into the American sphere, Ottawa responded with something far more powerful than outrage, a firm, unmistakable reaffirmation that Greenland's sovereignty is not up for negotiation. Canada didn't whisper it. Canada didn't hedge. Canada said it straight. And in doing so, Canada positioned itself as the responsible Arctic power, the one capable of leadership when others stumble into theatrics. This is the moment Canada draws a bright line in the snow. The Arctic is not a playground for geopolitical fantasies. It is a region with real people, real sovereignty, and real stakes. The controversy began when Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry, recently elevated by President Donald Trump to serve as an unofficial envoy to Greenland, declared that his goal was to make Greenland a part of the United States. The remark spiraled instantly, even after he tried to soften the message.
We don't go in there trying to conquer anybody, trying to, take over anybody's country. We say, listen, we represent liberty. We represent economic strength. We represent protection.
The damage was done. Denmark, which governs Greenland as part of the Kingdom of Denmark, summoned the U.S. ambassador to demand an explanation. Greenlandic leaders expressed shock and frustration, and observers noted something extraordinary. For the first time in recent memory, many Greenlanders felt more threatened by the United States than by China or Russia. Into this diplomatic storm stepped Canada. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand announced that she had spoken directly with her Danish counterpart to reaffirm Canada's full support for Denmark's sovereignty and for Greenland's right to self-governance. She made the message even clearer by stating that Arctic security is a core Canadian priority, and then she added a decisive move. She will travel to Nuuk early next year to open a permanent Canadian consulate there, the most meaningful expansion of Canadian diplomatic presence in the Arctic in years. While Washington scrambled to explain a controversy of its own creation, Ottawa delivered a coherent position rooted in stability, sovereignty, and respect. This Arctic flare-up did not appear out of nowhere. It fits a familiar pattern in Trump-era foreign policy, where bold declarations are made without regard to diplomatic consequences. In 2019, Trump floated the idea of buying Greenland outright. That suggestion was dismissed immediately. But in 2025, during Trump's second term, the idea has come back with more ideological weight and more potential for real damage. What happened this week mirrored the same sequence, a provocative American statement followed by alarm among allies, and finally a vacuum of leadership. But this time, rather than waiting for a rescue from European institutions or NATO bureaucracy, Canada filled the gap. Ottawa didn't simply offer reassurance, it stepped forward with a tangible strategy, affirming sovereignty, strengthening Denmark's position, and expanding Canada's northern footprint. This is where the shift becomes clear. Washington ignited the crisis, Canada contained it. Arctic politics are no longer symbolic. They involve critical minerals, emerging shipping routes, military positioning, and enormous economic potential. They also involve long-standing relationships between indigenous communities, northern governments, and national administrations. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada has embraced a more deliberate Arctic identity. Ottawa views the North as a strategic region that requires consistent diplomacy, reliable partnerships, and a rules-based framework. By moving swiftly to back Greenland and Denmark, Canada reinforced the most important principle in northern governance. Borders and sovereignty are not bargaining chips. The decision to open a consulate in Nuuk signals something deeper. It demonstrates that Canada intends to be present, not occasionally, not ceremonially, but structurally. It anchors Canadian influence where it matters most and builds trust with Greenlandic institutions at a time when Arctic security is becoming a defining issue of the decade. While the U.S. projected confusion and unilateral ambition, Canada projected seriousness and continuity. The contrast could not be sharper. Denmark's response to the U.S. envoy was swift and uncompromising. Greenland is part of the Danish realm unless and until Greenlanders choose otherwise, and any external attempt to alter that reality violates the principles that underpin Arctic cooperation. Canada understood this immediately and aligned itself with Denmark not out of convenience but out of principle. By doing so, Canada strengthened its credibility as a defender of the northern rules-based order. It signaled to allies that Ottawa can be counted on, not only when Canadian interests are at stake, but when northern stability itself is in question. Greenland's voice also matters in this equation. For a region that has historically been pressured by global powers, hearing Canada reaffirm its self-governing rights carried weight. It reinforced the idea that Arctic nations must operate on respect, not coercion. The comparison between the two North American powers is impossible to ignore. Canada is building a long-term Arctic strategy rooted in collaboration, diplomacy, and stability. The United States, meanwhile, has revived a rhetoric of territorial expansion that evokes an earlier geopolitical era. Trump's belief that Greenland should be part of the United States reflects a worldview in which geography is a prize and small nations are bargaining tokens. Whether Washington truly intends to pursue such a policy is almost irrelevant. The perception alone is enough to destabilize the region. It pushes allies away, unsettles local communities, and invites external powers, particularly Russia, to exploit the uncertainty.
Canada has no interest in watching the Arctic turn into a playground for geopolitical brinkmanship. By responding decisively, Ottawa made clear that the North cannot be governed by impulsive declarations. It must be anchored in stability.
There is another dimension to this moment. Canada is no longer treating Arctic diplomacy as a niche file. The Carney government has elevated the North as a central part of its foreign policy identity. That includes stronger defense cooperation with Scandinavian partners, renewed investment in northern infrastructure, and an expanded diplomatic network across the circumpolar region. Canada is stepping into a role that many Arctic observers long believed it could play, a calm, principled northern leader capable of guiding regional cooperation even when larger powers stumble. In many ways, Canada's response to the Greenland controversy is the clearest expression yet of that new identity. This episode is far more than a brief diplomatic dispute. It is a window into the shifting architecture of Arctic power. Washington's misstep revealed a deep uncertainty in its northern approach. Denmark's firm response reaffirmed long-standing norms. And Canada's entrance into the debate signaled a quiet but profound evolution in its Arctic posture. Canada is no longer simply reacting to events in the North, it is shaping them. The only remaining question is whether the United States will adjust its approach, or whether Canada's decisive voice will continue to define the Arctic conversation in the years ahead.
At this historic moment, I would say Canada is very proud not only to work with the EU and our G7 partners, also to develop the AI adoption blueprint that helps SMEs adopt AI with confidence and drive the next wave of growth and prosperity.
Canada has officially signed major agreements with Germany and the European Union on artificial intelligence and digital sovereignty, right when the United States, under Donald Trump, is isolating itself with tariff wars, regulatory unpredictability, and collapsing international trust. This isn't just another diplomatic handshake. This is Europe choosing Canada as its strategic partner for the digital future and openly distancing itself from Washington's volatile approach to technology. At the G7 Digital and Tech Ministers meetings in Montreal, Canada, unveiled two major memoranda of understanding with Germany and the EU. These agreements deepen cooperation on AI standards, governance, skills development, privacy protection, digital credentials, and the infrastructure required to underpin an entire generation of AI adoption. What makes this moment historic is Europe's willingness to integrate Canada into its high-performance computing ecosystem, including the Euro HPC network, one of the most advanced supercomputing infrastructures on the planet. Throughout the announcement, European leaders made one message clear: trust. Trust in how data is used, trust in how technology is governed, trust in Canada's democratic stability. Germany's digital minister even described Canada as a partner capable not only of scaling frontier technologies, but of doing so with purpose and values. Canada's industry minister, Mélanie Joly, echoed the sentiment, emphasizing that Canadians and Europeans share a commitment to privacy, safety, and the kind of responsible AI that improves lives rather than disrupts them. This deal lands at a critical moment in global politics. Under President Donald Trump's second term, the United States has shifted from a predictable partner to an economic wildcard. Trump's escalating tariff threats, from automobiles to digital services, have strained Washington's relationships with allies who once relied on American consistency. According to recent reporting from Reuters and AP, EU officials privately described the U.S. as unreliable on digital governance and nearly impossible to coordinate with on long-term technology frameworks. While the U.S. withdraws into protectionism, Canada has moved steadily in the opposite direction, positioning itself as a stable, trustworthy, rules-based partner. Europe is responding to that contrast. In the vacuum left by Trump's unpredictability, Canada is stepping forward as the North American voice that Europe can actually work with. The repeated emphasis on trust was not accidental. It was a diplomatic signal. When European leaders speak about safety, privacy, and responsible AI, they are drawing a line between countries that safeguard democratic rights and countries that use technology as a political tool. In this moment, under Trump's trade war governance, the United States finds itself on the wrong side of that line. Canada, meanwhile, offers exactly what Europe wants: policy stability, democratic alignment, transparent regulation, and a long history of cooperation on privacy and digital rights. Europe is effectively stating that the future of AI should not be built on unilateralism or economic coercion, but on shared standards and shared values, and right now, Canada is the partner who embodies both.
One of the most significant breakthroughs is Europe's invitation for Canada to join its high-performance computing ecosystem. This is not symbolic. It places Canadian researchers, innovators, and public institutions inside the same supercomputing infrastructure driving Europe's most advanced AI initiatives. In an era where AI development increasingly depends on computing power rather than just algorithms, access to Euro HPC means access to the beating heart of global AI capability. Europe did not extend this invitation lightly. It is a statement of confidence in Canada's long-term role in shaping the world's digital architecture, something Washington used to lead but no longer guarantees. And this invitation comes at a moment when global competition for compute capacity is exploding. Nations are racing to secure access to GPUs, cloud resources, and supercomputers. Canada's entry into Europe's system positions it ahead of not only the United States under Trump's fragmented tech policies, but also ahead of several G7 countries still struggling to define a cohesive AI strategy. For Canadian companies, this isn't just symbolic prestige, it is a direct advantage in training models, conducting research, and accelerating commercialization in ways that U.S. firms may soon envy. With these agreements, Canada and Europe are forming a new kind of geopolitical alliance, a digital sovereignty bloc. This bloc is designed around democratic values, responsible innovation, and the protection of citizens' rights in an age where data, algorithms, and infrastructure are the new battlegrounds. It is a counterweight to both the authoritarian tech models emerging from China and the increasingly unpredictable policy swings coming out of Trump's Washington. Canada gains leverage as a central player in this alliance. Europe gains a reliable North American partner who won't drag the bloc into trade wars. And the United States, once the undisputed leader of global digital governance, now finds itself watching from the sidelines as its closest allies construct an alternative future without it. What's more, this bloc gives Canada something it has long lacked: scale. By aligning with a market of 450 million Europeans, Canada can push AI standards that reflect its own values, rather than simply adapting to frameworks written in Washington or Beijing. This shift will have long-term consequences for everything from privacy rules to cloud infrastructure to cross-border data flows. What's happening here is a direct consequence of Trump's governance style. His tariff-based approach to diplomacy has weakened U.S. influence across critical industries, from semiconductors to clean energy to AI. American technology firms face whiplash from sudden policy reversals. International partners struggle to plan around U.S. regulations, and major allies have begun to quietly diversify away from Washington. Recent announcements, such as multinational cloud and AI investments in Canada, not the U.S., reflect a shift driven partly by political risk. Global companies are choosing stability over size. Canada offers that stability. Trump does not. And Europe's new partnership with Canada is the clearest sign yet that global leadership in AI is drifting northward. Canada's agreements with Germany and the EU represent a profound shift in the geopolitics of technology.
They are more than cooperative documents. They are blueprints for a new digital order built on trust, accountability, and democratic values. Europe has chosen Canada as a cornerstone of that order precisely because the United States, under Trump's volatile leadership, no longer guarantees those principles. Canada now stands at the center of a new transatlantic tech alliance, plugged into Europe's most powerful AI infrastructure and aligned with its most advanced regulatory systems. The question facing Washington is no longer whether it will lead the future of AI, but whether it will even be invited to participate. And as Canada and Europe shape the digital future together, Americans may soon find themselves asking, when did the world start trusting Ottawa more than Washington?
I think that what is really, really important to remember is that first and foremost, the auto industry is victim of the tariffs, of the American tariffs. And Stellantis' decision to move production from Brampton to the US is completely unacceptable. So we're suing Stellantis because basically we had a deal, they broke it, and we want our money back.
Canada has crossed a line it rarely crosses. Ottawa is now suing Stellantis, one of the world's largest automakers, after the company abandoned its production commitment in Brampton. And according to Industry Minister Mélanie Joly, this crisis didn't begin in Canada at all. It began in Washington, with Donald Trump's tariffs blowing apart North America's auto supply chain and pushing companies into decisions that hurt Canadian workers. This is more than a corporate dispute. It is a moment where Canada is openly defending its industrial sovereignty and pushing back against the economic chaos that Trump's trade war has unleashed.
The confrontation escalated when Stellantis shifted Jeep Compass production from Brampton, Ontario to the United States, cutting roughly 3,500 Canadian jobs. In response, Mélanie Joly made an unusually blunt statement on national television. "We're suing Stellantis because we had a deal. They broke it. We want our money back." That sentence set the tone for Canada's new approach: firm, unapologetic, and very public. The deal Joly refers to involves the multi-billion-dollar Next Star battery project in Windsor, a joint venture between LG Energy Solution and Stellantis. Canada agreed to support the plant with generous incentives, but only if Stellantis upheld its commitment to keep production in Brampton. When the company walked away, Ottawa filed a notice of default, the legal precursor to a full lawsuit. What makes this case even more political is the way Joly framed the cause. She stated plainly, the auto industry is victim of the American tariffs. In her telling, Stellantis didn't suddenly fall out of love with Ontario. The company reacted to the shockwaves coming from Trump's tariff regime, a regime designed to pull manufacturing back into the U.S., even at the expense of America's closest trading partners. The lawsuit marks a turning point in Canada's strategy toward U.S. economic pressure. Trump's 25% auto tariffs, reinstated and expanded when he returned to office, were intended to force companies to shift production into patriotic compliance with American industrial policy. But the outcome has been far messier. Integrated supply chains, especially those connecting Ontario, Michigan, and Ohio, are unraveling under the strain. Reuters and Bloomberg both reported sharp price increases and production declines in the U.S. auto market, along with strong criticism from American auto associations. Canada, meanwhile, is refusing to simply absorb the damage. Joly explained that protecting Canada's auto industry means taking a firm stand. She reminded viewers that the sector supports 125,000 direct jobs and more than 500,000 overall, making it the single most economically significant manufacturing ecosystem in the country. Losing one plant is not just a political embarrassment, it is a threat to the long-term stability of the national economy. She said she would not allow a floodgate of automakers leaving the country. If Stellantis could break its deal without consequences, other companies might follow. That is why the lawsuit matters far beyond Brampton. At the same time, Canada's broader strategy is shifting. The Carney government has grown increasingly skeptical of relying on the United States as the country's dominant economic partner. Ottawa has expanded trade talks with Asia, deepened defense and industrial cooperation with South Korea and Japan, and taken steps to diversify exports of aluminum, steel, and energy. Canada is behaving less like a dependent neighbor and more like a mid-sized power choosing where and how it engages. While Canada is asserting itself, the United States is dealing with its own fallout. Trump's tariffs, which he described as necessary for American prosperity, are now hitting American wallets. New vehicle prices are rising. U.S. automakers are warning of up to 2 million fewer vehicles sold this year. Business groups in Michigan, one of Trump's key political bases, have criticized the tariffs as destabilizing and harmful. Jolie seized on this point and stated that Americans now understand tariffs are simply taxes and the burden is falling on consumers, not foreign governments. The geopolitical layer makes the situation even more complex. At a recent U.S. congressional hearing, some American officials accused Canada and Mexico of becoming potential back doors for Chinese materials entering the U.S. market. Jolie rejected that insinuation and reaffirmed Canada's consistent engagement with U.S. regulators. Her comment reinforced a larger message. Canada is playing by the rules and defending its interests, while the U.S. is projecting suspicion outward to deflect from its own policy failures. Inside Canada, there is also a political dimension. Jolie criticized the Conservative opposition for refusing to form a Team Canada front against U.S. pressure. She reminded Canadians that during the NAFTA renegotiations years ago, political unity was essential. The subtext was clear. At a time when Trump is reshaping North American trade with unilateral tariffs, internal division weakens Canada's negotiating position. The lawsuit against Stellantis, therefore, becomes not only an economic tool, but a political message about national unity. And beyond the political theater, there is a deeper shift happening in how Canadians understand their place in the North American economy. For years, there was an assumption that access to the U.S. market was guaranteed, reliable, and stable. But the Trump era has shaken that belief to its core. In community after community, Canadians are beginning to ask whether tying their economic future to American political volatility is still worth the risk. Ottawa's decision to hold Stellantis accountable signals a new confidence, a belief that Canada can and must protect its industries even if Washington disapproves. There is also a growing recognition that Canada's value to the global economy is rising. Critical minerals, battery supply chains, renewable power, artificial intelligence, and clean industrial capacity are sectors where Canada is now attracting international investment. The Stellantis lawsuit fits into that narrative as well. Canada is telling global companies, if you want access to taxpayer support, you must respect the commitments you make. If you break them, there will be consequences. This is not just about Stellantis. It is about setting new rules for how Canada conducts itself in the next decade of industrial policy.
Canada's lawsuit against Stellantis signals a profound shift in how the country navigates economic conflict with the United States. No longer content with polite diplomacy and private negotiations, Ottawa is responding to Trump-era industrial pressure with legal force, public accountability, and a readiness to fight for its own economic future. This is only the beginning. Stellantis may choose to negotiate, restore jobs, or challenge Canada's claims. Trump may escalate tariffs further. Supply chains may tighten or fracture, but one outcome is already clear. Canada is no longer playing defense. It is actively shaping the terms of its economic destiny. The real question now is whether Trump's protectionist agenda can withstand Canada's pushback, or whether the political story he built around bringing auto jobs back to America is already starting to unravel. The next few months will reveal whether this lawsuit becomes a defining case in North American industrial politics.